Eleanor pressed her pale face against the train window, watching the endless prairie roll past like waves on a golden ocean. Her threadbare dress, carefully mended at the sleeves, spoke of hard times in Philadelphia, times that had driven her to answer an advertisement in the Matrimonial Gazette. Rancher seeking wife. Must be of good character and willing to work hard. Comfortable home provided. The advertisement had been sparse, almost brutally honest in its simplicity. The accompanying letter from Mr. James Thornton had been equally plain. He was 32, owned a ranch in Montana Territory, and needed a wife to help manage his household. No flowery promises, no declarations of future affection. Just facts, delivered in careful, blocky handwriting. Eleanor had responded immediately. At 26, she was considered past her prime for marriage in Philadelphia society. Her father's death 3 years prior had left her and her mother destitute, forcing them to take in laundry and mending. When her mother passed last winter, Eleanor found herself truly alone, working 16-hour days in a textile factory for wages barely sufficient to rent a single room. The matrimonial advertisement had seemed like providence, or perhaps desperation in written form. Montana Territory, the ticket agent had said, eyeing her skeptically when she purchased her ticket. That's rough country, miss. You sure about this? She hadn't been sure. But what choice did she have? Return to the factory, breathing in lint until her lungs gave out like so many other girls? Become a burden to her distant cousins who had made it clear they had no room for an unmarried woman? No. Montana Territory represented hope, even if that hope came wrapped in uncertainty. James's letters had arrived weekly during their 3-month correspondence. Each one revealed a little more. He'd been ranching for 8 years, had a few hands working for him, preferred reading to socializing, and valued honesty above all else. He never mentioned love, and Eleanor appreciated that. This was a practical arrangement, not a fairy tale. We're approaching Thornfield Station, the conductor announced, jolting Eleanor from her thoughts. Her heart hammered as she gathered her single carpetbag. Everything she owned in the world fit inside it. Through the window, she could see a small cluster of buildings that constituted the town, a general store, a saloon, a church, and perhaps a dozen houses scattered like seeds across the landscape. On the platform stood a solitary figure, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a worn hat pulled low over his eyes. James Thornton, presumably. Even from this distance, Eleanor could sense his stillness, the way he stood apart from the bustling activity of the station. The train hissed to a stop. Eleanor's hands trembled as she smoothed her dress, wishing desperately that she had something better to wear for this first meeting. First impressions mattered, and she knew she looked like exactly what she was, a poor city girl with nothing to offer but a willingness to work. She stepped onto the platform, and the Montana wind immediately pulled at her hair, carrying with it the scent of grass, earth, and something wild she couldn't name. It was so different from Philadelphia's coal smoke and crowded streets. The tall man approached, removing his hat. His face was weathered and angular, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into the sun. But his eyes, a startling blue, held a gentleness that his stern features belied. Miss Eleanor Whitmore. His voice was deep, quiet, almost lost in the wind. Yes. Mr. Thornton. He nodded, and for a long moment, they simply studied each other, two strangers about to bind their lives together. Welcome to Montana, he said finally, reaching for her bag. I hope the journey wasn't too difficult. It was long, but manageable. Eleanor searched for something else to say, some way to bridge the awkward distance between them. Thank you for meeting me. Of course. He gestured toward a wagon hitched to two sturdy horses. The ranch is about an hour's ride. We should get going before dark. As Eleanor settled onto the hard wagon seat, she steeled herself for whatever awaited. She'd expected poverty, a small cabin, rough living, endless work. She'd prepared herself to face hardship with dignity. She had no idea how wrong her expectations were. The wagon rolled through land that seemed to stretch forever, endless grass rippling under a sky so vast it made Eleanor dizzy. James drove in near silence, occasionally pointing out a landmark, a distant butte, a creek crossing, but offering little conversation. Eleanor had expected as much from his letters. He described himself as a man of few words, and he'd been truthful about that at least. "I should explain," James said suddenly, breaking nearly 30 minutes of silence, "the ranch, it's not what you might be expecting." Eleanor's stomach tightened. Was it worse than she'd imagined? A sod house, perhaps, half carved into the earth? She'd seen pictures. Many homesteaders lived that way. "I understand, Mr. Thornton. I'm prepared for modest circumstances. I'm not afraid of hard work." He glanced at her, something unreadable crossing his face. "I know. Your letters made that clear. But still." He seemed to struggle with words. "I wasn't entirely forthcoming in my advertisement." Now Eleanor's anxiety spiked. What hadn't he told her? Was he already married? Was this some elaborate deception? As if sensing her panic, James quickly continued. "There's something I need you to see. We're almost there." They crested a hill, and Eleanor's breath caught. Below them, nestled in a valley where a river glinted silver in the afternoon sun, stood an estate that belonged in the pages of a novel, not the wilds of Montana Territory. A magnificent three-story house, no, a mansion, dominated the landscape, built of honey-colored stone with a wraparound porch and tall windows that caught the light. Surrounding it were pristine white outbuildings, a massive barn, a stable that looked larger than the Philadelphia factory she'd worked in, several cottages, and what appeared to be a bunkhouse. Hundreds of cattle dotted the valley, tended by distant figures on horseback. Horses, dozens of them, grazed in paddocks near the stable. The entire operation sprawled across the landscape like a small kingdom. "That's..." Eleanor couldn't form words. "That's your ranch?" "Yes, ma'am." James's voice was carefully neutral. "The Thornton Ranch. 20,000 acres. We run about 5,000 head of cattle, plus the horse breeding operation. 20,000 acres. Eleanor's mind reeled. She'd expected a homestead, a modest claim, a rough life. This was wealth, substantial wealth. "But your advertisement, you said, comfortable home. You said you needed help managing the household. I thought." She turned to him, confusion and something like anger rising in her chest. "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" James stopped the wagon, turning to face her fully for the first time. In the golden afternoon light, she could see the weariness in his eyes, the weight of something he'd been carrying. "Because the truth scares them away," he said quietly. "Or it attracts the wrong kind of woman. I don't understand." He sighed, staring out at the valley. "I've tried this before, Miss Whitmore. 3 years ago, I was honest in my advertisement. I mentioned the size of the ranch, the success of the operation. Do you know what happened?" Eleanor shook her head. "I received 200 responses. 200 women, and when I read their letters, I could tell they weren't interested in me. They were interested in what I owned. The ones who came to visit." He paused, jaw tightening. "They saw dollar signs. They saw an easy life. They didn't see a partnership or a life to be built together. They saw wealth to be claimed. And the one you chose jilted me 3 days before the wedding. Ran off with my account manager after she convinced him to help her access my funds." The bitterness in his voice was barely controlled. "Cost me $20,000 and whatever pride I had left." Eleanor sat in stunned silence, understanding dawning. "So you lied in your advertisement." "I omitted," he corrected gently. "I wanted someone who'd come for the right reasons. Someone willing to build a life from scratch, or so she thought. Someone with character and grit, not someone dazzled by money." He looked at her directly, those blue eyes searching. "Your letters, you never asked about finances. You never asked what I was worth. You asked about my character, my faith, my hopes for a family. You talked about partnership and commitment. Because those are what matter, Eleanor said, still processing everything she was seeing. Exactly. James gathered the reins again, preparing to continue down to the valley. But now you know the truth, Miss Whitmore. I'm a wealthy man. This ranch has made me more money than I know what to do with. I live simply because that's who I am, but the wealth is real. And I need to know, now that you know what I own, are you still the woman who wrote those letters? Or does this change things? Eleanor looked down at the mansion, at the sprawling ranch operation, at the evidence of prosperity she'd never dared dream of. Then she looked at. The interior of the house proved even more overwhelming than its exterior. Eleanor stood in the marble-floored entryway, her cheap carpetbag clutched in her hands, feeling utterly out of place. A massive staircase curved upward to the second floor, its banister gleaming with polish. Oil paintings in gilded frames adorned the walls. Through open doorways, she glimpsed a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a parlor with furniture finer than anything she'd ever sat on, and a dining room with a table that could seat 20. Mrs. Chen. James called out. We're here. A small, efficient-looking Chinese woman emerged from what Eleanor assumed was the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She was perhaps 50, with sharp, intelligent eyes that took in Eleanor with one swift glance. So, this is the new Mrs. Thornton. Her English was perfect, her tone warm but assessing. Not yet, James said. Eleanor, this is Mrs. Chen. She's been managing the household for 6 years. She's the real boss around here, I just own the place. Mrs. Chen smiled at that. He's not entirely wrong. Miss Whitmore, welcome. I've prepared the guest room for you. The wedding is in 3 days, yes. 3 days. Eleanor had known from their correspondence that James wanted to marry quickly. He'd arranged for the circuit judge to visit specifically for this purpose. At the time, it had seemed practical. Now, standing in this palace, the reality of what she was about to do hit her with fresh force. Yes, she managed. 3 days. Good. That gives you time to settle in, meet the ranch operations, and change your mind if you need to. Mrs. Chen's directness was refreshing, even if the words were unsettling. I won't change my mind, Eleanor said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Over the next 3 days, Eleanor discovered that James's wealth went far beyond the house and land. He employed 23 people full-time, ranch hands, stable workers, a blacksmith, a foreman, Mrs. Chen, and 2 kitchen assistants, a housekeeper, and several others whose jobs Eleanor was still learning. They all lived on the ranch property, and James knew every one of them by name, knew their families, their struggles, their dreams. This is what I meant about managing the household, James explained on the second day, as they toured the operation. Mrs. Chen handles the house itself brilliantly, but there's the school I started for the workers' children, that needs oversight. There's the medical care I provide, we have a doctor who visits monthly, but someone needs to coordinate that. There are disputes to mediate, supplies to order, celebrations to plan. I need a partner who can help me care for these people properly. Someone who sees them as people, not servants. Eleanor began to understand. James had been looking for someone with empathy, with organizational skills, with the kind of character that would value his workers' well-being. He hadn't wanted a society wife who'd look down on the ranching families or treat the staff poorly. She met with Mrs. Chen daily, learning the household operations. She visited the small schoolhouse where the workers' children, a mix of white, Chinese, Mexican, and Native American kids, learned together, taught by a young woman named Miss Sarah who'd come from Boston 2 years prior. She toured the bunkhouse and workers' cottages, noting what needed repair or improvement. And slowly, she began to speak with James himself, real conversations that went beyond pleasantries. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch, watching the sunset paint the valley in impossible colors, and talk. Why ranching? She asked on the second evening. With this kind of success, you could live anywhere. Do anything. I grew up with nothing, James said quietly. My father was a ranch hand, worked himself to death for wages that barely fed us. When he died, I was 14. I swore then that if I ever had anything, I'd treat my workers better than he was treated. Pay them fairly. Give them decent housing. Educate their children. Respect their dignity. And you've done that. I've tried. He glanced at her. It's lonely though, Eleanor. Building all this alone. I want someone to share it with. Someone to build something even bigger with, not in terms of money or land, but in terms of impact. Legacy. Family. On the morning of the third day, Eleanor woke to find a dress laid out on her bed, a simple but elegant wedding gown in cream-colored silk, tailored perfectly to her measurements. A note from James lay beside it, not from me, from Mrs. Chen and the other women on the ranch. They wanted you to have something special. J. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. In 3 days, these people had welcomed her more warmly than Philadelphia society ever had in 26 years. That afternoon, she married James Thornton in the small church in Thornfield, surrounded by the entire ranch community. The quiet cowboy who'd shocked her with his wheel. 6 months after the wedding, Eleanor sat at the large desk in what had become her office, a sun-filled room on the second floor overlooking the valley, and marveled at how much her life had transformed. The poor factory girl from Philadelphia seemed like someone from another lifetime. But the transformation hadn't come easily or without challenges. The first major conflict had arisen within weeks of the wedding. James's business partner, Richard Harrison, who managed the ranch's financial investments in Denver, had visited to meet the new Mrs. Thornton. He'd been polite but clearly skeptical, treating Eleanor with barely concealed condescension. "James, might I speak with you privately?" Richard had asked after dinner, as if Eleanor weren't sitting right there. "Anything you need to say can be said in front of my wife," James had replied, his tone mild but firm. Richard had proceeded to suggest that James establish a separate account for household expenses, with appropriate limits, to prevent misunderstandings. The implication was clear: he thought Eleanor was a fortune hunter who needed to be controlled. Eleanor had felt her face burn with humiliation and anger, but before she could speak, James had stood abruptly. "Richard, I think you've misunderstood the nature of my marriage. Eleanor isn't an employee to be managed or a child to be given an allowance. She's my partner. Her name is on every account I own. If she wants to buy a diamond mine tomorrow, she can. But James, you barely know her. I know her character. I know her heart. That's enough." James's quiet voice had held steel. "If you can't respect my wife, you can't work for me. Is that clear?" Richard had left the next morning and sent his resignation from Denver. James had never mentioned it again, but Eleanor had felt the weight of his trust settle on her shoulders like a mantle. With that trust had come responsibility. Eleanor had thrown herself into the work she'd promised to do. She'd reorganized the school, hiring an additional teacher and expanding the curriculum. She'd established a lending library, ordering boxes of books from back east. She'd started a medical fund, ensuring that any worker who fell ill would be cared for without losing their wages. And she'd begun to understand the true scope of James's vision. He wasn't just running a successful ranch, he was building a model community, proving that treating workers with dignity and paying them fairly could coexist with profit. "I want to expand the workers' cottages," Eleanor said one evening, showing James her sketches. "For more, larger ones for families. And I think we should start a profit-sharing program, give the senior workers a stake in the ranch's success." James had studied her drawings, then looked at her with those blue eyes that had become so dear to her. "You sound like you're planning to stay a while." "I am." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "This is my home now, James. These people are my people. I'm not going anywhere." Something shifted between them in that moment. Their marriage had begun as a practical arrangement, conducted with polite distance. But over months of working side by side, of late-night conversations about dreams and fears, of small kindnesses and shared laughter, something deeper had grown. "I love you, Eleanor," James said quietly. "I didn't expect to. I wasn't looking for it. But I do." Eleanor felt her heart swell with an emotion she'd been afraid to name. "I love you too. Not because of this house or the money or any of it. I love the man who hides his wealth so he can find genuine connection. I love the man who knows every worker's name and their children's names. I love you, James." That night marked a true beginning for them, a transformation from partnership into genuine intimacy. By the end of their first year together, Eleanor was pregnant with their first child. The ranch had expanded, the school had doubled in size, and they'd started a program to help workers save for their own land. On their first anniversary, James gave Eleanor a simple gift, a new sign for the ranch entrance. It read, "Thornton Ranch, built on trust, grown with love, founded in partnership." "It's not just my ranch anymore," he explained. "It's ours. Everything I have is ours. Everything we build is together." Eleanor had come to Montana Territory expecting poverty, prepared to face hardship with a quiet cowboy who needed help managing a modest homestead. Instead, she'd found wealth beyond measure, not in the mansion or the land or the money, but in the life they were building together, in the community they were nurturing, and in the love that had blossomed unexpectedly between two lonely people who'd been brave enough to take a chance on each other. The quiet cowboy had indeed shocked her, but not in the way she'd ever expected. He'd shown her that true wealth wasn't about what you owned, but about what you shared, what you built, and who you became together.